This video provides an overview of the first 5 years of Nazi rule, when the German state stripped the country's Jews of their rights as citizens, preparing the ground for the Holocaust. It's divided into 3 sections: the erosion of democracy and the beginning of state-sponsored anti-Semitism, the growth of the SS and the spread of Nazism into all areas of German life, the systematic exclusion and expulsion of Jews. Dismantling democracy and identifying the scapegoat. President von Hindenburg proclaimed Hitler as German Chancellor in January 1933, and yet another election was called for March, triggering a period of heightened tension across the country. That election was contested in a climate of fear. The stormtroopers' tactics of violent suppression against the communist opposition had the effect of terrorising and silencing politicians of all other rival parties as well. When Parliament reconvened, Hitler was able to persuade a majority of members to pass what was called the Enabling Act, which authorised Hitler to bypass the law and rule by decree, effectively making him a dictator. A major factor behind the increased support for the Nazis and their charismatic leader was fear. Hitler's supporters bought into the scapegoating rhetoric that characterised Jews as a disease that threatened the health of German society, and opponents were increasingly intimidated by the violent tactics employed by the brown shirt thugs, whose racist worldview was being emboldened by the day. These tactics can be seen in the coordinated boycott of Jewish businesses during the run-up to the March election. Highly visible campaigns such as this one, targeted at shop owner Nathan Schmidt, were aimed at hundreds of Jewish-owned businesses across the country. The first steps along the process that eventually led to the final solution: establishing a police state and the Nazification of Germany. Central to Germany's transformation into a one-party police state was Heinrich Himmler, an ardent follower of Hitler since the early 1920s. He was the impetus behind the SS, a ruthlessly violent police force exclusively constructed from so-called Aryans of pure German descent. Racial purity was at the heart of their philosophy, justifying their brutality on the belief that they were cleansing Germany of its degenerate enemies, such as the Jews. Himmler would become the main architect of the infrastructure that enabled the Holocaust, and by expanding the ranks of the fanatical SS, he commanded a vast network of concentration camps. The first of these was built on the grounds of an abandoned munitions factory in a small medieval town near Munich called Dachau, and where political opponents to the new regime were sent. The cold-blooded murder of 4 men from this SS-run institution, allegedly for trying to escape, is the first documented example of Jews being executed in a concentration camp. Crucial to the success of this new order was a process that has been termed Nazification, where party sympathisers were placed in positions of authority in all aspects of German society. At the heart of this process was Joseph Goebbels, whose Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda also monitored the content of all forms of written and broadcast media. Critics of Hitler and the Nazi policies were intimidated, imprisoned, and even murdered. This approach was vigorously applied to the youth of the country. In May 1933, Goebbels coordinated a series of book-burning ceremonies where students were encouraged to search library shelves for books deemed to be non-German. Consequently, thousands of publications, many written by Jews, were destroyed. The death of President von Hindenburg in the summer of 1934 finally enabled Hitler to take control of every arm of the German state, and as Führer he commanded an even stronger devotion from his people. Huge effort was put into shaping the minds of the younger generation through the Hitler Youth Movement. Thousands of children attended highly militaristic camps that taught unquestioning obedience to Hitler and the importance of racial purity. The indoctrination process was so strong that children were encouraged to report their own parents to the authorities if they suspected them of holding anti-Nazi views. As Hitler said at a Nazi party rally, "He alone who owns the youth gains the future." Isolating the scapegoat. The Nazi Party wanted to end Jewish influence in all spheres of German life. But despite the brutality that Jews were experiencing at this time, the final solution of mass annihilation that eventually murdered 2/3 of Europe's Jews was yet to be formalized. During these early years, the aim was to make life for Jews so unbearable that they would choose to emigrate. It's important to consider what the Jewish population of Germany actually was in the early 1930s. Practically all German Jewish families lived in major cities and had done so for many generations. Their population totaled just over 500,000. The entire population of Germany was approximately 67 million. So the dangerous Jewish menace that Hitler wanted to end came from less than 1% of the country's population. At the heart of Nazi racist ideology was the belief that so-called pure German blood would somehow be contaminated if mixed with impure non-Aryan Jewish blood. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws were passed, legally clarifying precisely who had the right to be a full German citizen and who didn't. This poster was produced to explain how the law worked. As this child's exercise book illustrates, the so-called citizenship law was taught in schools across the country. Newspapers were the primary source of information, and by the mid-30s, the most widely read were Völkischer Beobachter, the National Observer, which was the official Nazi party paper, and Der Stürmer, the Attacker, a weekly publication created by a fanatical follower of Hitler and fierce anti-Semite called Julius Streicher. By 1935, Der Stürmer's readership was about 500,000, although its reach was much wider than that, as many read its pages on public display boards. The paper was known for its hideous cartoons that perpetuated myths about Jews and the power they were supposed to wield over society. Der Stürmer was actually prevented from publication in the summer of 1936 for the duration of the Berlin Olympic Games. The whole event was a massive public relations exercise for Germany, who wanted to project the best possible image of itself to the world. Despite many calls to boycott the Games, 49 countries eventually took part, and the world's press, descended on a Berlin where anti-Semitic signs and posters had been removed. The Olympics were considered by Germany to have been a success, even though the star performance came from the multi-gold medal winning African-American athlete Jesse Owens. It's tempting to think that the triumph of a black athlete would cause embarrassment to a country steeped in racial superiority. In fact, Goebbels' propaganda machine presented it as mere confirmation of the racist belief that black people were directly descended from animals and therefore could only be expected to be unnaturally faster than racially superior whites. Art and music too had to conform to the Aryan values of racial superiority. In Munich, the Eternal Jew exhibition promoted anti-Semitic myths and stereotypes, and in Düsseldorf, the Degenerate Music exhibition warned against the corrupting influence of jazz. Literally hundreds of laws were passed by the Nazis that placed increasingly tighter restrictions on Jews. Systematically, more and more areas of German society were being closed off, as illustrated by this bench, which was reserved solely for the use of non-Jews. Edicts were passed down on a daily basis that banned Jews from attending, for example, restaurants, health spas, public schools, parks, cinemas and swimming pools. Banned from owning gold or silver, telephones, typewriters, radios, bicycles and pets. And banned from practically any form of employment, either as owner or worker. As was mentioned earlier, it was Nazi policy during this time to make life for German Jews so unbearable that they would choose to emigrate. And many Jews did, although it was a highly complex and expensive process. In the first 2 years of Nazi rule, about 40,000 of Germany's 500,000 Jews managed to get out. These were largely wealthy families that could afford the exorbitant cost of leaving their country of birth, unable to take their savings with them. Some managed to get to Palestine, which was under British control at the time, but for those who found refuge in neighbouring European countries, it proved only to be a temporary reprieve, as many were to die in concentration camps when Hitler eventually invaded their new homes. Jewish emigration slowed down between 1935 and 1938. More and more draconian restrictions were being imposed, and the compulsory red J stamped on all Jewish passports symbolised a growing erosion of their rights. Nonetheless, few people imagined the Nazis staying in power for much longer. And besides, as the cost of emigration became even more crippling, most of the remaining families couldn't afford to leave anyway. But the barriers to emigration weren't just internal. Once a family had made the traumatic decision to leave, another country had to be found that was willing to take them in. That was extremely difficult. Despite being well aware of the dreadful plight of Jews in Germany, few countries were willing to grant more than a very limited number of visas. In July 1938, representatives of 32 countries convened in Evian, on the banks of Lake Geneva, to discuss a collective response to the growing demand for Jews desperate to escape Nazi persecution. Over the 9 days, country after country, including America, Canada, the United Kingdom and France, expressed lots of sympathy, but no real practical help for Jews. The main reasons put forward for this were financial, as refugees were unlikely to be able to support themselves, but other more sinister views were expressed. The Canadians said, "We must seek to keep this part of the continent free from too great an intermix of foreign strains of blood." And the Australians said that they had no racial problems and did not want to create any by bringing in Jewish refugees. Consequently, Goebbels was able to present the conference as the rest of the world being as unwilling to accommodate Jews as Germany was. 3 months before this conference, Hitler had led his troops into neighbouring Austria, the country of his birth. Despite condemnation from the rest of Europe, Germany was able to annex its smaller neighbour. Vast numbers of Nazi sympathisers lined the streets to greet their new rulers, and overnight the restrictions that had taken the Nazis 5 years to impose on Germany's Jews were instantly imposed on the Jews of Austria. The wave of attacks on Jewish businesses that swept Germany and Austria on the 9th and 10th of November 1938 were a turning point. The 5 years of systematic dehumanization of Jews in the eyes of their fellow countrymen had created a tinderbox of anger that was ready to be ignited, and it was Goebbels who lit the fuse, ordering that Jewish businesses and synagogues should be destroyed and that police should allow these attacks to take place unhindered. Although these riots were led by the stormtroopers, many non-uniformed Germans joined in the frenzy of violence. Over 250 synagogues and 7,000 Jewish shops were destroyed, and 30,000 Jewish men were taken to concentration camps in what the Nazis came to call Kristallnacht, because of the vast amount of shattered glass that coated the streets. This shattered shopfront is daubed with the message that the owner is now on holiday in Dachau. The Night of Broken Glass, the November pogrom, marked the start of a new phase in the process that led to the Holocaust. There were no longer any Jews who thought Nazi rule was just a passing phase. The future was now totally uncertain, and panic began to spread through the petrified community. Those who had contemplated leaving were even more desperate to do so, and at any cost. Jewish communities across the world stepped up their efforts to help as many as possible to get out. In the UK, a group of charitable organisations lobbied the government to allow in Jewish child refugees, a scheme that became known as the Kindertransport. In total, 10,000 children from Germany, Austria and occupied Czechoslovakia were admitted. At the time, this was only intended to provide temporary refuge. Children were only accepted on the scheme on the understanding that they would eventually return to their homes. But that was before anyone knew of the devastation that lay ahead. Few could have predicted that in every conceivable sense, the concept of home for these children, most of whom never saw their parents again, was going to be destroyed.